In the summer of 1951, a year after it began, the war in Korea had reached a stalemate. Day after day, American bombers pounded the communists to accept UN conditions for a truce. Deep below ground, from the safety of his ornate command bunker, Kim Il-sung led the grim resistance of the North Korean people. With outright military victory beyond reach of either side, the war assumed a new dimension. The new struggle involved the prisoners of war, and the battle became a struggle for their souls.
I was one against one, as far as my interrogator was concerned. As we got into it and they became more severe with their interrogation, I took the attitude that, no, it wasn't one-on-one. It was me against the entire 900 million Chinese.
In July 1951, following secret discussions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the combatants agreed to meet in Korea to discuss a truce. The United Nations delegation flew off to meet their North Korean and Chinese adversaries on the 38th parallel. In the first year, the war had moved like a piston up and down the Korean peninsula. Following their invasion, the North Koreans took 90% of the South. Then, after the Incheon landing, UN forces swept north to the border, provoking China's intervention in the war. Together, the communists briefly pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, the line that marked the original division between the two Koreas. As the UN position strengthened, there were talks with the Soviets in the summer of 1951 that led to a proposal for a truce.
The Soviet people believed that as the first step, discussions should be started between the belligerents for a ceasefire and an armistice, providing for the mutual withdrawal of forces from the 38th parallel.
The Soviet proposal seemed to indicate that the communists were ready for a quick agreement. America, too, was keen to stop the bloodshed. Within 2 weeks, U.S. Vice Admiral Turner Joy, chief UN delegate, completed the journey to the truce table in transport thoughtfully provided by the other side, captured American jeeps flying white flags. Communist cameramen were on hand to record the humiliating scene. The UN were presented as though suing for peace. It was to be a battle of wits as well as a battle of words, as UN delegate Rear Admiral Arleigh Burke soon discovered.
When we sat down, we were taller than the communists on the other side, than the Chinese and Koreans. And so when we came back after a couple of hours, probably lunch, our chair legs had been sawed off about an inch, so that our heads were about the same height. They were very careful to make sure that we had no point of superiority over them.
One-upsmanship took other forms. Armed communist guards paraded in the supposedly neutral truce zone. China and North Korea were flexing their muscles.
We should not forget that these were two countries which were not acknowledged by the Americans, and not only by the Americans, by most of the Western world and by the UN. China, the mainland, did not exist. China was Formosa, Chiang Kai-shek, and Korea did not exist either. And in this war, they proved that they exist.
In their negotiations, the communists were determined to turn this recognition to their advantage. Agreement lay at the end of a long and bitter road. Even the agenda was the subject of tedious wrangling. America spoke on behalf of her UN allies. South Korea had a delegate on the team, Major General Paek Sun-yup.
아마 이 유엔군 측에서는 빨리 이 모든 것을 아마 단시일 내에 해결이 되는 줄 알았는데
The UN command thought the negotiations would be settled very easily. But the communist side was rather insistent on every detail and delayed on every item. The North Koreans insisted that the armistice line be drawn along the 38th parallel, whereas our side wanted to follow the actual line of military contact.
UN forces now numbered 500,000 men from 16 nations. They had achieved superiority in manpower, combined with far better equipment and logistics. UN artillery could shell the communists from secure positions. For the first time, there was a continuous front line that seemed unbreakable.
The war was mainly one of feeling for each other's weaknesses, sometimes vicious attacks by the enemy at night, at which stage we would fire onto our own positions with airburst ranging, scattering shrapnel and killing the Chinese in large numbers.
The UN's superior firepower took its toll. Perhaps 1.5 million communist soldiers died in the Korean War, 10 times the losses on the UN side. The war reached deep behind the front. The United States Air Force destroyed almost every town and city in North Korea.
We traveled in moonlight, so my impression was that I am traveling on the moon, because there was only devastation, and in a very funny way, every city was a collection of chimneys. I don't know why houses collapsed and chimneys did not, but I saw thousands of chimneys, and that was all.
큰 도시 다시 뒤집고 와서 그 북단 쪽에서 파괴가 싹 그린 거죠.
When I filmed the destruction of the city by the B-29 aircraft, I had to tie myself and my camera onto a large pillar, since otherwise I would have been blown away. If a large bomb, such as a 1-ton bomb, exploded, the blast was so strong it would demolish everything within 150 feet, just like paper.
$600,000 tons of bombs fell on the north. Possibly 2 million civilians perished.
As I was filming, a child begged me to save his mother's life. He didn't realize she was already dead. I went on filming him, even through my tears. I had my job to do as a cameraman. I didn't stop even to wipe away his blood or strap up the wound on his back. I still feel a dreadful pain whenever I remember that scene.
To survive the hail of bombs, North Korea moved much of its economy underground, digging deep into the hills. A subterranean world was created, with factories, dormitories, shops, and hospitals. Down in the tunnels, people could feel safe and lead a semblance of normal life. As in the South, Koreans never neglected education. Inevitably, though, it was the war effort and munitions output which took highest priority. With many men at the front, women took over all aspects of production and waged their own battle against the enemy.
We had a slogan, "The rear is the front. Let's make bullets of revenge to give to the Americans." So we tried to produce more bullets and mortar shells quickly to send to the front night and day. We even took our meals beside the machines.
There was pride in standing up to the greatest power on earth. North Koreans rallied round their government and their leader, Kim Il-sung, who was presented as the object of almost religious adoration. The price of this resistance was high, but Kim Il-sung, speaking in his bunker on the anniversary of liberation from Japan, seemed heedless of the cost.
It was a long speech, much ovation, applauded, and after the speech there was a party. There was singing and drinking and dancing. During all this time, we heard the bombs falling on Pyongyang. But it was not very convenient to show that we hear it. I mean, we had to behave as nothing would happen. And the whole party lasted up to 5 or 6 in the morning. Then, with the daylight, we went upstairs. And on the street, I saw hundreds and hundreds of people killed during that night by bombs.
Operation Strangle was the code name for the Air Force bombing campaign. Its stated purpose was to disrupt the flow of communist supplies. The damage assessment photographs look impressive, but the view from the cockpit was often illusory.
The terrible irony of the bombing of North Korea is that it didn't affect the war effort, and it didn't really pulverize or destroy their society. We never found a way to stop their supply lines, for example. These little guys with A-frames on their back carrying several hundred pounds of supplies simply couldn't be hit by bombing. The reason for this is very simple. It goes back to the bombing survey done of World War II. That German morale was not hurt by the bombing so much as stiffened. The German industrial production went up rather than down in the context of the bombing. Bombing is not an effective strategy for ending a war or stopping supply lines. It is an effective strategy for tearing up cities.
In October 1951, after a long interruption, talks resumed in tents set up at a new site, Panmunjom. The Chinese had a new chief delegate, General Bien, and with his arrival came agreement that the truce line should follow the military front. But many differences remained. The talks became a war in themselves, a war of disinformation and patience under the impatient eyes of the world's press. On one occasion, the delegates simply glared at each other in silence for more than 2 hours. Many disputes in the truce tent seemed petty. But determining where the battle line was had now assumed importance.
A military armistice conference, the very first thing that you have to determine is where are the forces now. So that's what we did, and we thought it would be fairly easy to determine battle line within a quarter of a mile. Not so. And we said, we know where we are. We think that you are right there. Within a few yards. And so the line of demarcation, the battle line, should be halfway in between our foremost troops. And they said, oh, no. No. You are not there. We are here. And we're getting maybe a quarter of a mile. Well, we went, we discussed that, argued, didn't get any place, went back and found out that the enemy had launched an attack and had taken that land.
The UN side also kept fighting while talking. They launched an autumn offensive to take strategic ground and put pressure on the negotiations.
All is quiet along Korea's western front, temporarily. 1st Marine and ROK units plot a surprise attack on communist positions entrenched in the hills near the Panmunjom truce site. The big guns under their camouflage netting open up. Veil of secrecy hangs over the truce tents at Panmunjom, not far distant. But here, a veil of fire accents our determination to prosecute a war until a truce is at last won. The commies find it hard to double-talk a flamethrower.
But the communists had found a defense. As in the cities, they dug tunnels, 1,000 kilometers, to form an underground Great Wall right across the front.
At first, the tunnels were a straight-through corridor type, which was uncomfortable to live in. We then started to build various living facilities. A canteen, a blacksmith shop, bedrooms, and a bathroom using the natural water dripping down from the tunnel. We also built the facilities for battles. As you can see here, guns were installed in the tunnels, and there were ammunition stores, a lookout post, and firing positions.
North Korea and China had never fought an entrenched war like this, but the West had. The ground fighting at this stage was reminiscent of the First World War, as one member of the 1,000-strong French volunteer battalion recalled.
Heartbreak Ridge was exactly like Verdun. Look at the photographs taken there, and you will see what it must have been like at Verdun. And the logic of the fighting was also the same, to improve our frontline position, because the politicians were already talking at Panmunjom, or frankly exchanging views, as we say these days.
Bombs were one frank way to exchange views. In a highly secret operation, codenamed Hudson Harbor, the U.S. tested dummy atomic bombs.
Operation Hudson Harbor occurred during the Truman administration in the fall of 1951, and there still is much to be learned about it. Essentially, it consisted of dropping dummy atomic bombs on North Korean positions to try to establish the capability for using the atomic bomb in tactical battlefield situations. In the implementation of this policy, lone B-29s were lifted off Guam or Okinawa, sent over Korea, and a very large conventional bomb was dropped in the pattern that one would drop an atomic bomb. One needed to know the wind current. Of course, one also wanted to intimidate the enemy. And you can imagine Kim Il-sung in his bunker requiring nerves of steel to see these lone B-29s coming in on the radar, and then a big conventional bomb shutting down.
As the second winter of the war set in, the peace talks began to make some headway. Following agreement on the demarcation line, discussions moved on to the question of prisoners of war. Lists were exchanged. Each side thought the others contained far too few names. Details were telegraphed home. For 3,200 American families, including that of the highest-ranking prisoner, General Dean, there were good tidings at Christmas. But the names of 8,000 other missing soldiers were absent. For UN prisoners in communist hands, the ordeal was far from over. The POWs on both sides became the focus of the conflict and the key to peace. Their story is one of the strangest tales of the Korean War. Communist propaganda film paints a rosy picture of life in northern holiday camps. The reality was different. Early in the war, some prisoners, including Western civilians, were force-marched north under a notorious Korean officer known as the Tiger.
The Tiger had dropped to the back of the march at this time, and he came striding along by the march and found these men lying by the roadside. And in a great rage, he stopped the march and said, I gave orders that no one was to be allowed to fall out. Who allowed these men to fall out? And they discovered that the men had fallen out from 5 sections. He said, I'm going to shoot the leaders of these sections. So Commissioner Law intervened, and finally the Tiger said, well, I'll shoot the leader of the section from which most men fell out. Which leader is that? And Lieutenant Thornton from Texas stepped forward.
Have you any reason why I shouldn't shoot you, said the Tiger to the lieutenant. The lieutenant said, this, in our country, would be unacceptable. I would be given a trial. So the Tiger turned to the assembled Koreans and asked whether they thought the lieutenant was guilty or not. And they all shouted that yes, he was guilty. The Tiger said to Lieutenant Thornton, you've had your trial. In our country, sir, he said, we call that lynching. And he was shot in the head and thrown in a ditch, the People's Hospital.
Conditions during the first year under the care of the North Koreans were appalling. Food, medicine, shelter, everything was lacking.
The vermin infestation was terrible. We used to sit and, like the monkeys, and pick the lice off each other, and I remember reaching a high of 59 on one of my friends. The lice in the eyebrows and lice in the hair and lice in the ears. We had absolutely frozen conditions. We had universal dysentery by that time. No way to purify our water. Every man, liquid stool, bloody stool, to the point where he was unable to contain himself and even make it outside. And so the clothing was soiled, and it was smelly, and the ground was covered with frozen excretia.
The camp itself was in a disgusting state already. People were suffering with dysentery and things like that. And people were dying right, left and centre, mostly from malnutrition. And as we arrived at Pyeongchang, one of our friends had already gotten ahead on an ox cart, Eddie Kurd, and he said, you haven't seen anything yet. He said, you wait till tonight, so when they carry them out. And sort of thought, you know, and in the evening time, they took about 30 or 40 people out, dead Americans, mostly.
1/3 of all American prisoners perished. Starved, frozen, and demoralized, they fell victim to disease. Facilities for treating the sick and wounded were primitive.
I would, for instance, see a man who would have an elbow with a deep wound into the bone. It looked like he was going to lose his arm. I would tell him that, look, I have a little diarrhea. Why don't you meet me down by the train, the split train? infested with flies. We would take them down there and sit on the fence near there. I'd unwrap his wound and look at him and let a few flies walk over it. And didn't want to tell him what I was going to do. I don't know if they'd let me do it. Then wrap him back up and say, let's see you in a week. They would come back in a week and complain about itching intensely. And they'd take it off, of course, it was loaded with maggots. The thing that one must understand is maggots is a marvelous way to treat a wound. A maggot will only eat dead tissue. And when the dead tissue is gone, they drop off and leave. And so they will totally clean out every recess of the wound, but nothing else will work on.
By the beginning of 1952, most UN prisoners were resettled in camps near the Yalu River. Concerned by the high death rate under the North Koreans, the Chinese had taken charge of the Western POWs. Successful escape was impossible, but at least in these new camps, conditions improved.
My work in the Army concerned enemy prisoners of war. Our policy towards the prisoners was to treat them well and to protect their lives and property.
There was no great physical brutality inside the camps by the Chinese as there was by the North Koreans, who would beat people up at the drop of a hat and on occasion kill them. Quite the contrary, the Chinese had a disciplined atmosphere. Even so, it was not a pleasant atmosphere. It was one full of duplicity. The whole character of the camp was that we were a lot of bad hats who'd got to be reformed. At times it took the form that we were naughty children, and that Nanny was going to punish us until we fell into line and admitted our mistakes.
The Chinese had no doubt whatever in their indoctrination sessions, which took place every morning from 9:30 till midday, and again from 2 till 4 in the afternoon. They had no doubt whatever that these indoctrination sessions would undermine our previous convictions and would convert us to the principles of Marxism-Leninism. And as they often said to us under the terms of their famous lenient policy, their phrase, not mine, their famous lenient policy, we could liquidate you immediately as war criminals. You've come here to wage this bloody war in Korea for world capitalism against the peace-loving peoples of the world. We have the right to liquidate you, but we know that you are just little pawns in the great capitalist game. You are tools in the hands of your capitalist masters. And therefore, we are going to give you the chance of being re-educated.
Well, the first lesson was about 5 or 6 months after we all gathered in a large camp by the Yalu River. They taught us that communism was good, that life in Russia was good, that everybody has equal rights. As Turks, we did not pay any attention to these lessons. We used to say, what you tell us is a pack of lies. We can see how you live. You are giving us just a bowl of millet a day. We absolutely rejected what was said and told them so.
Mostly, they talked about, they would bring us up from slavery, what was happening to blacks at the agricultural South, and why slavery was abolished, and because the northern industry need more cheap labor power and so forth. That is the only reason Lincoln freed the blacks, the black slaves, so that they could use them in the industrial north as another labor force. And they also talked to us about discrimination, segregation, voting rights. We had no rights, and things of that nature. Well, all of that stuff made sense to us because we already knew it. They didn't have to impound that, and I just bring it up. So it wasn't a question of accepting it. We knew it already.
Dr. Shadish once discussed the point of this re-education with one of his Chinese captors.
I said to him, you know, if you look out the window in the compound, the lowest man out there, when he goes home, will live better than you will ever dream. How do you intend with this indoctrination to make communists out of us when we know that? And he laughed and said, Doctor, that's where you're wrong. We don't intend to make communists out of you. And I will remember the rest of my life what he said. He said, if I can make that much doubt in your mind that your country is wrong,
Communist POWs were engaged in a different battle. Some never survived in the overcrowded holds of U.S. troop ships. The U.S. took control of POWs from South Koreans and moved them to the island of Kojedo, far from the war zone. Some arriving here were agents deliberately captured to cause trouble. For Chinese and North Korean POWs, the war was by no means over.
Each day brings new prisoners to Kojedo, prisoners who were taught by their leaders to expect torture and death. Instead, they receive a new insight into UN policy, humane treatment by our military police force, and strict conformity with the articles of the Geneva Convention. Oriental prisoners carry lice and vermin for long periods before their capture. A week of segregation and daily dusting eradicates these disease-carrying pests.
This impression of docile prisoners enjoying the warm care of the UN was misleading. South Korean guards often mistreated their captives. To one observer, so did U.S. supervisors.
They regarded them as Oriental cattle and referred to them as slit-eyed yellow bastards. And rarely didn't treat them as one expected to be treated under the Geneva Convention.
From the beginning, Chinese and North Korean prisoners of war resisted captivity.
Although we were imprisoned physically, spiritually, we never submitted to the Americans. We were still soldiers of the Korean People's Army, and we would go on fighting until our death, if necessary. We knew the question of the prisoners of war was being discussed at the truce talks, so it was important that we struggled to help our fatherland. We fought with desperate resolution.
They were an example, I think, as far as military history goes, to how prisoners of war should behave to create the maximum nuisance value and to bring combat troops from the front line to the prisoner of war compounds to control them.
The basic mistake that we made in handling these prisoners, in my opinion, was this. We deloused them, cleaned them up when they arrived there, and gave them copies of the Korean Convention and expected them to be good boys. Well, they didn't play by the Geneva rules. They had no rules except their own. And we were terribly naive. If we had killed a few at first, we wouldn't have had to kill so many later on.
Many problems at Kojedo stemmed from a process of screening prisoners. The policy was called voluntary repatriation. Its stated purpose was to prevent the return of communist prisoners to their homelands against their will. It was not a part of the Geneva Convention, but the U.S. had insisted on it.
How could any of us belong to the free and civilized world and turn thousands of men who have denounced communism to the wrath and murderous fury of the enemy? To do so would undo all the principles for which we have been fighting in Korea. No longer would the helpless countries of the world regard us as the protectors of the weak. Our promises would be meaningless.
President Truman had been deeply offended by the treatment given to Russian prisoners who had been returned to the Soviet Union against their will in Europe. Indeed, some of those prisoners simply committed suicide rather than going back. So Truman decided that we would not return prisoners in Korea who did not wish to return.
Truman's policy offered an escape to Taiwan for Chinese POWs, but the U.S. controlled only the perimeter of the camps, and the policy encouraged violence among political factions inside.
When we came into the prison camp, we were left entirely to our own devices. We divided ourselves into various groups. Some of us wanted to go back to the mainland. Some of us wanted to go to Taiwan. So we had what you might call political conflict. You want to go back to the mainland? Well, we'll kill you.
The camp was divided into many compounds. Where Chinese nationalists held sway, they tattooed anti-communist slogans on fellow prisoners, making it painfully difficult for anyone later to change allegiance.
In our compound, there were some pro-communist agitators. Whenever they did anything, we heard about it. We handed them over to the Americans, who transferred them to a communist compound. A few escaped and rejoined us, because everyone in our compound had anti-communist tattoos, and the pro-communist compound insisted on removing them. So those who were afraid of being skinned alive had to come back.
Prison guards avoided these hardline compounds. In compounds where the North Korean communists were in control, they dominated with an iron hand. North Koreans brutally disciplined fellow prisoners who wavered from the party line.
If anybody tried to escape from the compound, they were pulled back and either put to death by a water hose being put in their mouth and leaving them to drown, or they were hauled up to the ridge poles of the tents and tied up by their testicles, or they were speared.
I think that it was impossible to have a free and fair screening under the circumstances that prevailed inside the prisoner of war compound. For the very simple reason that a man was putting his life on the line when he committed himself. He was subject to he was a target on one side or the other.
As a newsman, Caius Beach shuttled between the two scenes of action, Kojedo and Panmunjom. Inside the tents, the peace talks bogged down on the prisoner repatriation issue. In April 1952, the UN side announced that only half the prisoners it held wished to return home. The communists were incensed. They charged that screening promoted defections through intimidation. The impact on the talks was disastrous, as North Korean delegate Kim Ha-kim recalls.
그러나 이 제국주의자들은 소위 자유송환이라는
We never thought that the talks over this matter would block the negotiation. However, the U.S. imperialists maneuvered to hand the prisoners over to Syngman Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek under the pretext of voluntary repatriation. That is why it took so long.
As moral issues increasingly became the subject of international debate and propaganda, the communist side introduced an explosive ingredient. North Korea and China announced that America was dropping infected insects on both their territories. The U.S. government vehemently denied the accusation. Hungarian journalist Tibor Murray was shown the evidence.
When I looked, I still saw flies who were alive. And they moved. They didn't fly, but they moved on the snow. The village people told me that before they found these flies, during the night, American planes flew over the village, and they didn't drop any bombs as they used to do. They didn't even understand why these planes flew there. They understood only next day when they found the flies.
The communists said that widespread germ attacks had occurred, particularly on population centers far behind the front line. They claimed to identify many diseases, including plague, anthrax, and cholera. Among those who helped spread the charges was Wilfred Burchett, an Australian journalist sympathetic to the communists.
Germ warfare was carried out. There's no doubt, nothing would ever shake me on that. Germ warfare was carried out, perhaps not on the Perhaps not on a very large, at the least, a very large experimental scale.
In the winter of 1951, China and North Korea launched public health campaigns to try to control widespread epidemics. Their propaganda film said this was necessary to meet the threat of germ warfare. The germ warfare issue was also used to strengthen solidarity and heighten anti-American sentiment. Germ warfare became a divisive international issue, with protests not only in the communist bloc, but also in some Western capitals. The U.S. vigorously denied the charges.
In the whole black record of false propaganda, these charges should stand out as a monumental warning to the American people and to the free world. A warning as menacing and as urgent as a forest fire bearing down upon a wooden village. The extent to which communist leaders worldwide have gone in fabricating, disseminating, and persistently pursuing these false charges should impress upon the brains of those who yet fail or refuse to see the purpose of communism, the deadly danger with which it confronts us and the free world.
In 1952, an international scientific commission of sympathetic scientists from 6 countries was invited to China and North Korea. They met Kim Il-sung. They did not actually witness germ warfare, but spent 2 months examining evidence previously compiled by leading Chinese scientists. The commission concluded that the evidence supported the Chinese case, that the U.S. had engaged in germ warfare.
A laboratory assistant extracts a spider with a pair of sterilized forceps and grinds it in a sterile mortar and streaks it on an agar plate. The next morning, the assistant takes the agar plate out of the incubator and, under supervision of a specialist, she examines the appearance of the bacterial cultures that have grown on its surface. They have the characteristic form of colonies of the anthrax bacillus.
I found the film really quite naive and scientifically unsound. In fact, I'll go as far as saying that scientifically it was quite absurd.
This leading British epidemiologist discounts not only the film, but the report of the International Scientific Commission as well. Among others, he questions the report's finding that the U.S. used anthrax.
Articles of soil contaminated by anthrax will remain infected for many years, possibly until the end of this century. Therefore, if a region or an area was contaminated with anthrax, it would be quite uninhabitable. There are 3 forms of anthrax. One form affects the skin, produces ulceration, and usually is not fatal. One form affects the gastrointestinal tract. And the third form, which is dangerous, is spread by inhalation, and that is the respiratory type of anthrax. If indeed there were outbreaks of respiratory anthrax, anthrax pneumonia, I think the world would have known about it. But possibly the most important factor is the fact that an area which was contaminated with anthrax would be uninhabitable.
The controversy extended beyond the merits of the evidence found to how it got there. The Chinese charged that U.S. planes dropped canisters filled with infected insects. During the war, Tibor Murray developed some doubts.
Once I was told that during the night, the village where this hospital was attacked by germ warfare. The peasants found flies or fleas on the snow. And one of the Hungarian doctors told me, you see, I spoke with one of the peasants. He already spoke some Korean. And he told me that there were no American planes. There were the Chinese soldiers who put this fly on the eye. And the doctor added immediately, but you know the peasants, they say one thing and then they say the contrary. So I just mentioned the story to you.
But the Scientific Commission heard from captured American airmen who, it said, freely confessed to carrying out germ warfare attacks.
When my son asked me what I did in Korea, how can I tell him that I came over here and dropped germ bombs on people, destroying them, bringing death and destruction? How can I go back and face my family in a civilized world? How can I tell them these things? That I'm a criminal in the eyes of humanity.
A few foreign journalists were also permitted to interview the flyers. The French poet and writer Claude Roy, here on the left, was able to talk to another one, Kenneth Enoch, with some freedom.
L'autre, qui s'appelait Enoch,
the other one, whose name was Enoch, was more withdrawn. But he also told us how he dropped germ bombs, and that it was very bad.
Notice that these bombs were already loaded and checked for us. But after we had dropped them, we were to get rid of the rest of our load as quickly as possible and return immediately to base.
A moment later, I was in the toilet having a pee, and Enoch was next to me. And he said, "None of that's true, you know." I said, "Why tell it then?"
I want to come back home.
The four flyers on the Chinese film, including Kenneth Enoch, all signed detailed confessions. Enoch's story to the French writer in the bathroom, as he requested, was never published. Enoch later swore that Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett helped the Chinese prepare his confession. Half of some 200 U.S. airmen captured were pressured to sign confessions. Some did, most did not.
The first session was the worst. It ran for 82 days. The interrogation was conducted right off the bat by two teams of 3 men apiece. And I was interrogated both day and night for the first 37 days.
They'd get me up in the morning, and I'd go appear in front of them, and they'd question me all day long. And I didn't answer, and you can expect that you can get away with that. They would question it. You have to answer, and they go back to questions that were not of military significance to try and get you talking again, and so on.
Threats of execution, threats of non-repatriation, threats of not being able to go home and see my family again, and so forth. It was generally an interrogation that kept you awake and tried to beat you down, getting a confession out of you, a false confession.
And I saw myself slipping, and pretty badly. I found that I was having trouble concentrating. I couldn't sleep, worried not only about making a confession, but what would happen to the free world if they bought that confession.
I felt at the moment that I was one against one, as far as my interrogator was concerned. As we got into it and they became more severe with their interrogation, I took the attitude that, no, it wasn't one-on-one. It was me against the entire 900 million Chinese. And I felt that I could stand up against them.
And as time went by, they kept saying, you're not going to go home unless you make a germ warfare confession. And so I finally decided that I would do that.
I finally ended up by saying exactly what I felt, however, that I would rather die than sign a confession. And I think that perhaps that final statement was the one that actually concluded my interrogation.
I wanted to be able to come home to the United States and tell what had happened to me and what I had seen from a military standpoint that I felt we would need to know in our intelligence community, and then also to tell what happened in this germ warfare thing, because at one point during the interrogations they had played tape recordings of 4 airmen who had flown for me, lesser-ranking guys, who had confessed and implicated me as the leader of the germ warfare effect. So I thought that if I had a chance to get home, this was going to be my ticket. And if I didn't confess, I could stay there for as long as they wanted to keep me.
However, it was the...
Colonel Mahurin later recanted the confession he had made after 15 months of interrogation, including 7 months of solitary confinement.
Germ warfare. I made a confession. It was not a confession that had any basis in fact whatsoever. The confession I made was ridiculous, preposterous. Our country had never waged germ warfare under any stretch of the imagination, nor had any other members of the United Nations.
The germ warfare accusation has been kept alive by recently declassified documents. They reveal that a year before the charges against the airmen, the Joint Chiefs had recommended development of biological weapons and testing them in the field, though there is no suggestion of tests in Korea. One supporter of the program says it was to deter the communists from using germ warfare.
We were very poorly prepared to deal with it. It could have been devastating. And I particularly felt that it was compelling that we build up our own retaliatory capability, not as an affirmative weapon, but as a preventive weapon. And we did set out to do so.
Other documents reveal approval of a cover and deception plan if biological warfare were to be used. Though not proof it was used, these documents fuel speculation that will not end until all the files are declassified. In the propaganda war of 1952, the UN side was on the defensive. On Kojedo, the communist prisoners, at high cost to themselves, were about to score another victory. The troubled situation in the camp had developed into a crisis. Combat troops were sent in with orders to restore control. The problem arose when the commander in charge of the camp, Brigadier General Francis Dodd, agreed to meet POW leaders outside the compound gates. Dodd became the first American prison commandant to be taken captive by his own charges.
The prisoners had decided on the time, the moment when they clear out the human waste. The soldiers would open the gate, and the POWs would come out and throw out their feces. Then, when it's time to go back in, they had to open the gate again. So they're opening the gate, and General Dodd is standing there. And just at the moment when the POWs have disposed of their human wastes and are ready to go back in the compound, they push General Dodd violently into the compound, and the prisoners close the gate behind him. And then they pulled him inside the tent. That's what happened.
그것이 이제 그 당시에 일어났던 그 이제 현상인데 이 사람들이 우리가 끌어들여서 수용소 안에 갖다가 놓고 자, 우린 자원소환 하지 않겠다.
We dragged Dodd inside and held him in the prison compound. We told him we all wanted to return to the fatherland. So why this nonsense over voluntary repatriation?
이 도트도 그 안에서 인정했단 말입니다. 인정하고
Even the Geneva Convention allows prisoners to go home. Dodd agreed and promised to cancel the screening. So we told him, please go, and let him out. But then, in revenge, he destroyed the compound with heavy arms.
In fact, Dodd's replacement, General Charles Colson, had secured his release by agreeing to POW demands. But as soon as Dodd was safe, the UN command repudiated their agreement, made under coercion. Both Dodd and Colson were reduced in rank. A new commandant, General Bull Boatner, was dispatched to Kojedo to sort things out. The hardline communist compounds were retaken with a full-scale military assault. 1 American died. 31 POWs were killed, many by fellow prisoners. The rebellious compounds were subdued, but the political price was high. At the armistice talks, the communists were able to present the UN as a bully, using tanks and flamethrowers against defenseless prisoners. The talks stalled. They would drag on for another year. A year of mounting casualties on the front, another year of captivity for the prisoners of both sides.